But one thing I can say with certainty is what works is borrowing audiences. Here's what I do. I have my list of podcast friends, and then at the top I say podcast friends, podcast play date. This is so up your alley. So what is the play date? I'm going to put my podcast on with these podcast friends. What is the partnership? Are we going to be on each other's podcast as guests? Are we doing a 30-second ad read for each other? That's called a promo swap. Are we going to be swapping these promos with each other? Are we going to do a feed swap, which means I'm going to send them an entire episode of Our Friendly World for them, and they're going to upload that onto their feed, and they're going to send me an episode. I'm going to upload that to the Our Friendly World feed. That's called a feed swap.
Welcome to the event. I'm Craig Hewitt from Castos, along with Lauren from Tink Media. Lauren, how's it going?
It's great. I'm happy to be here.
I know. So we have a super interesting session lined up today where we are going to talk about podcast growth, right? Because that's what Lauren does. And Lauren, I'll give you a chance to introduce yourself in just a second. But what we're going to be doing is not just talking about this theoretically, but we have a crash test dummy. We have a subject. We have a brave soul who raised their hand and said, you can use me as the subject of your case study on how to grow a podcast audience. And that's what we're going to do. So we have Fawn and Matt in attendance here today. And Fawn and Matt, if you all are there, we are inviting you onto stage right now to where you'll be able to join the event and chat with Lauren and I. Lauren, while they're joining, do you want to just give a brief intro on kind of who you are, what you do, how you help podcasters, just to kind of set the stage for folks who don't know you yet?
Yeah, sure. My name is Lauren Passell, and I have this company called Tink Media, which helps podcasts grow. I also have 2 podcast newsletters you might be interested in. The newsletter is my baby, and it's just podcast recommendations. And I'm telling you about it because you might enjoy it, but also you can pitch me your podcast because I always take pitches and I write about podcasts all the time. And Podcast Marketing Magic is, a lot of the people from my team write it. It's so good. Sometimes I'm reading it as a reader and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is good. We give away all of our secrets. There are no secrets. We wear our hearts on our sleeve, and we give literally all the tips that we're using, everything that's working for podcast marketing. So, and podcast marketing is, I think it sounds like really boring and like not creative, and people don't want to spend time on it. But I think it's so creative and so fun and so collaborative. So my goal is to make everyone here, especially Matt, excited and leave with some ideas and think, I can do this. And there's a few things that I can do. And because I think it really, I love my job, and I wish more people had as much fun doing podcast marketing as I did. Maybe we need to rename it. Maybe we can also come up with a new name for it together.
Yeah. You know, Matt, we'll introduce you in just a second. But the thing I want to point out, kind of coming from a digital marketing background, is how different podcast promotion and marketing is from me marketing my company Castos or you marketing your service, right? Like the way that we approach podcasting should be quite different and custom to the medium that we're in. And I think that's like a large part of kind of what we're going to talk about today, as opposed to like, I want to, grow this Facebook page, or I want to grow this website or something like that. So, but this is not about me, Matt. This is about you and Fawn and your show. Tell us about the show. Tell us about kind of how y'all got started, where you are, and I think we'll just go from there.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yes, the name of our podcast is Our Friendly World with Fawn and Matt. I very much I usually very much take a second kind of position on this. I've always considered it her podcast. She shaped it, she's manipulated it, all the rest of it. But basically, it all stems from a conversation we had while we were living in the Puget Sound area of Seattle. And we were trying to make friends, and we were having a very difficult time of it. Maybe it was situational due to, the city we were living in, but who knows? But basically at that phase in our life, we discovered that had turned into a real challenge for us. And we were like, oh my God, it's like dating all over again, like meeting new people. And fast forward, we moved from there. We moved to just north of San Francisco. We moved to Colorado, and we encountered similar kind of triumphs and problems along the way as far as connecting and meeting with people. And we started the podcast right at the beginning of the pandemic as a way of just connecting. Before that, I mean, we had been focused on friendship the whole way through. I created a friendship matchmaking website. I'm a software programmer. And but basically, because we're all like locked in, we started our podcast. And along the way, we've discovered a lot of things. First of all, yeah, unless you're feeling very bold, do not Google loneliness epidemic. People do describe it that way. There's a lot of really lonely people out there who have a really, really hard time making friends, and modern day society is not making it any easier for us.
Gotcha. I appreciate that. Lauren, I'm going to let you kind of take the lead, because I'm sure with that, and you do this all the time, you do like this exact thing. Your mind is going crazy with a million questions. So I'll let you take it from here, and I'll give
thanks for that
as needed. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was really excited to talk to you because, well, number one, I just moved to a new city. So selfishly, I am in the process of meeting friends and being like, that was good, right? You like me, right? We're going to do this again. Like, anyways, I was just
right. Exactly.
Listening to your episodes, binging your show yesterday, but also because what works in podcast marketing is actually podcast friends. I'm going to explain what I mean by that, but I think I'm going to be able to use your show as kind of an example, but also I feel like you can use that to your advantage, coming from a show that is about friendship. But I'll explain what I mean by that. But first, and I think how I'm going to be running this is, this is something we do for people all the time. Usually we only are doing it with one podcast. So I'm going to be kind of trying to speak to you, but also kind of giving some general tips that everyone else can speak to. But anyway, so one thing I'd like to know from you is, what are your hopes and dreams for the show? And okay, actually I have 3 questions and I'll repeat them if you forget them. What are your hopes and dreams for the show? Like, are we talking like theme park, action figures, TV show? What is the goal? And then what do you do for marketing now? Like, do you do anything? Sometimes people say nothing, and I'm like, I get it. I hear you. And then also, you mentioned a database. I'm very interested to hear about any other things you have going on that are connected to the show at all. So let's start with your hopes and dreams for the podcast.
Okay, so honestly, it's about raising awareness. It's about me and my wife growing as a couple, frankly, because we found that the podcast has brought us even closer together, which has been nice. And just reaching as many people as humanly possible. We're not looking at theme park. Yeah, I mean, obviously, who wouldn't want to monetize? But, we're not as interested in that perspective. Yeah, those are our real goals, is just to expand our listenership, frankly.
Love it. And then what are you doing now, if anything? And you could be like, I'm not. And that's why I wanted to talk to you.
Right, absolutely. So, yeah, obviously, we use Castos to publish. Mm-hmm. We also then, in the process of editing, my wife, what you hear on the show is typically 100% of my participation in the show, aside from the setup and tear down of the audio equipment. So my wife goes through, she edits it, and she does the transcription, she does the SEO keywords, she does the keywords for, she does the keywords for Facebook, I think, and Instagram. And then she pushes it out she comments on it via Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram.
Great. That's a lot of work.
It is. Well, it's the transcription mostly, and the getting rid of all the ums and ahs and all the rest of it, to make it sound seamless is really, I think, is just a huge lion's share of the work.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times people are like, I can't do marketing because like what you just explained is a lot of work. And it's like, I can't add things. And it's like, well, there's a lot of tips. I'm probably going to bring up a lot of things. So my advice is pick 3 things that I say that you're like, aha, I can say that. So, but I just want to say, and thank you for doing transcripts. I mean, it's a smart thing to do for SEO and all that stuff, but it's also just an accessibility thing. So, and I mean, just so you know, like I'm even hearing like advertisers saying more. I know you don't, not looking to monetize, but just so everyone knows, advertisers are getting pickier about advertising with shows that have transcripts. Like they're just so important. And even as someone who has a podcast newsletter, I like to be able to search transcripts for if I'm writing about something. So anyway, just that is market related. I think it's great that you're doing that. And then, but so you're already doing a lot.
Lauren, if I could just ask real quick. Sorry, are you using the transcripts feature within Castos? Because we do it for free.
No, we end up, we pay for Descript.
Okay.
Because it'll go through and do a whole bunch of other things for us.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Just wanted to point out, because I mean, and just to double click on that, like it's super important. We made it free because everybody should have it. Everybody should have access to it. I get that like something like Descript has a little more kind of bells and whistles. And so we use Descript too, a bit for my personal show. And however you tackle that, I think it's important to have transcripts for your show.
Absolutely.
I think it's awesome you have free transcripts, because that's what I tell people a lot of the times, like, it doesn't even have to be perfect. Like but making the barrier for entry for transcripts is so important. So that's awesome.
Yep. Sorry, I'll let you go.
No, you said that. Okay. So then can you tell me about the database or anything else? You mentioned the database. Is that still going on, or what?
That was a project we subsequently shelved that project actually, because we've seen the marketplace just do its own thing, right?
We got to do. Okay, great. Okay, cool. So I'm going to split up this whole growth conversation into two kind of categories, and the way that I look at something when I get a client. So first of all, there's the PR angle, and then there's the marketing angle. I think they work together really well. They're very, very connected, but for the purpose of this conversation, the PR thing. So what I think I would do with you is, first, have you ever submitted your show to be featured on an app like Apple Podcasts or Spotify?
We certainly have registered with a number of lesser known indexes. We did that quite some time ago. I'm not sure how valid of a strategy that is anymore. I do not believe we have recently done any submissions, because we almost run the podcast as more of a quote unquote hobby.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. How many hours in the day do you have? If you've got a full-time job, et cetera, all of a sudden, your time gets more and more eaten away by this kind of stuff. So
I totally hear you. That's why. Okay, so I'm gonna keep that in mind, of your time, and prioritize this. I think submitting your show to be featured would be a good move. Not all the time, maybe once every quarter or something like that. So there are actual forms that Apple Podcasts and Spotify and a couple other platforms have, where you can submit your show to be featured. So that means when people open up Apple Podcasts, your show is front and center. And the reason that is so good is because, this is important. When I say something that I want you to write down or in your head or remember, I'll say, this is important. It's really hard to convert a non-listener to a listener. I don't know if you've ever tried to get someone who doesn't listen to podcasts. I have all the time, and it's very difficult and often doesn't work. I don't really try that hard to do that. That is not my job. That is not your job. Your job isn't to get more people listening to podcasts. Your job is to get people to listen to podcasts to listen to your podcast. So that's something to keep in mind for everything. It's why social media doesn't work that much. It's not why, we can get into that because that blows people's minds sometimes. I'm going to talk about social media. It's good for a lot of reasons, but it's a lot of people that don't listen to podcasts. You're not going to convert them. There's other reasons social media isn't the best, but that's a big one. But an app getting featured on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or something, that's huge. Those are podcast listeners and they're in searching mode. Okay. So it is worth your time because it's not a huge time commitment. And, you can streamline it. What I would say is I'm just going to use Apple Podcasts as the main example, but there's every app you can think of. Actually, a quick question for you. When you are putting this on social media and stuff, what link do you use? Do you send people to Apple Podcasts?
Everything gets spread out through Castos.
Oh, so then this is a question for Craig. Where Like, no, I guess I'm asking you though, like in your social media, like when you're linking on social media in your social media profile, or when you're sending
Okay.
it out to like, where are you sending people? Are you sending people to Apple Podcasts or?
We probably send them to Pod Page.
Okay, that's good. That was my question. Because and that's for everyone. It's don't ever send someone just to Apple Podcasts because they don't have an Apple device and you might lose them. So good,
Right.
good. Podpage. Love that. Everyone should be doing that. Or there's other ones too, but that's a great one. But I'm going to be using Apple Podcasts as like a example, but a lot of the apps are like this. But just, most of the apps have a process for submitting.
Right.
So it's a pretty simple form, but basically Apple Podcasts wants to look like a news page, basically. So when you're pitching, and it's a pretty simple process, you can go look at the form. If you Google the form, I'll send it to you. They want to know why now. Like there's all these shows that are submitting. Why? Is it they want timeliness, they want something exciting. With you, I would say when I would think really hard about the calendar year and think, when are people making new friends? Or there's like friendship days, like during the year. Or I don't know if you could tag it to if friendship is trending in the news or something like that. That's when I would really think about it. Or if you had a special episode or something, if you did a series. As someone in PR, I love it when people actually have seasons and they take time off, because then I can come back and say, new season, we're back, baby. That might be a good thing for you to do. You could submit to the apps and say, we're back with a new season. It's actually really good to take a break. Or I love a mini series. And mini series doesn't have to be a ton of extra work. It's just maybe, in the month of June, you interview queer friend groups or something like that. Like, and you're calling that a series or something like that. You are making kind of like a mini event. So coming up with a series and coming back from a season is a great moment to do PR. And that's a reason to build buzz, even if the buzz is there. Somebody have to make up buzz or, just like zhuzh it a little bit. So that would be a great reason to apply to the apps. The form is pretty straightforward, except I could spend an hour talking about the form, but we're going to talk about 2 fields real quick, because there's 2 fields I would pay extra close attention to. One of them says, what region do you want to, promote your podcast in? And that's all the countries. Most people are submitting in the US or Canada. Those are the most crowded categories by 10 zillion. I would look at other countries. I would look at your analytics and see where your listeners are. And I'm going to guess it's like other English speaking countries. I would apply to Australia, UK, India is usually big. Ireland, because there's less people submitting for those regions. You're much more likely to get selected. I had a client who was doing an American road trip podcast, and he had mentioned randomly that there were a lot of Italian listeners. And so I submitted to Italy and it got selected in Italy. So that's great, because that could get you, maybe now they know about you for next time, now they know about you. And also you can say that's another buzz building moment. Like, I was featured on Apple Podcasts. That's big. You can, tell your crowd about that. There's one more field that says, what is your marketing strategy? And it's funny because I don't think that's what the field should say. They don't really want to know your marketing strategy for the show. They want to know what they're saying is basically, we're Apple Podcasts. We're a company. We're doing you a favor by featuring you. What are you going to do for us? How does your marketing plan help Apple Podcasts? How are you marketing Apple Podcasts? And that's where I would say, we're going to tell our listeners to listen on Apple Podcasts. We have the Apple Podcast button on our homepage. We are going to drive people to Apple Podcasts in a tweet, and we have this many followers, all that stuff. Just make it seem like we're going to mention Apple Podcasts on the show. That's what they want to hear, that you are going to be a good partner in this.
To go back to one of the things you originally said, we've been doing the podcast since the beginning of the pandemic. So this is years. We release an episode every single week because we believe that consistency was important. Are you saying that we're better off taking summers off and coming back?
It doesn't have to be summers. I think a lot of the reason people are doing every week is because if they're monetizing, they have to.
Right.
That's why. Everyone has their own reasons. I would say, listen, as long as you are honest with your listeners about what you're doing and
Right.
upfront about it, and you say, I would start doing seasons. It doesn't have to be an entire summer. What if it's just 3 or 4 weeks off twice a year or something like that? Then you can spend a little more time marketing. I have another idea for you. And this is why I love that your show is about friendship, and I really want to talk about podcast friendships, but okay, so what works is podcast friendships, and that means swapping audiences with your podcast friends. I am going to get into that. But here's something you could do if you wanted consistency. Although I truly do believe if you said to your listeners, hey, we're going to take a break. We'll be back on this date so they don't worry, and you put it in your description and you explain to them that you will be coming back. No one will have a hard time with that. Nobody's going to unsubscribe because you're not putting, but if you wanted consistency and you wanted to give your listeners something, you could do what I call a feed warmer campaign. So I was working with this university and they were like, we're going to be gone for 9 months because I don't know, they had something going on. And sounds like maybe a baby, maybe that's how long babies take. So maybe, I don't know, I'm not really sure. But, and they said, is that bad? And I said, it's not bad as long as you're clear with your audience. That's a long time, right? But what we did was set up a feed warmer campaign for them. And what that was we went out, we found shows that were similar to theirs, what I call podcast friends, where the audience, your audience, you might not have them yet, but that's where they are. That's
right.
So I went to them and I looked at those shows and I found a perfect episode on those other shows that would be for my client.
Okay.
And then I found a perfect episode that my client had that would be really good on that other show. And I said, we want to swap these episodes. And so I basically made a mini season out of other people's episodes. And you have to be very clear with your listeners. You would say, we're taking 3 weeks off, but every week we have a special episode that we picked out from one of our podcast friends. You're going to love it. And here's why. And you can drop those episodes. So you're not doing a ton of work. I would introduce it at the beginning and say, we're doing an episode from Modern Love right now or something like that. And this is good for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's keeping your listeners engaged and it's getting you downloads, but also it's marketing. Because your episode is now on the feed of another podcast. They're going to hear your show and be like, oh my gosh, that sounds so great. So if you want, yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Lauren, I love this idea. And this very podcast where this episode will get kind of repurposed to has been kind of quiet for a while. One question I have there is if I do this kind of promo with another show, but my show is not active with my new content right now, is that bad? Or do I want to do this just before my own episodes are going to go out or just after so that people come in there and see like, oh, Matt or Craig has got a whole bunch of new stuff here. This is great. Rather than like, oh, they're just recycling other people's stuff.
Good question. I think that as long as you're clear with your audience, it doesn't matter. I might wait. Because then you can really come out with a bang when you have your new stuff. And then use this as like a filler. But I honestly believe it all comes down to as long as you tell your audience what you're doing. Like if you said, yeah, we're going to be doing we're getting ready for some new content. And in the meantime, we're sharing this with you, just as long as you're telling them what's going on. But personally, I think as a listener and as someone making stuff, I would do like, get ready. I'm so excited. We have this new stuff for you and save it for like almost a rainy day, or when you need a break. I do think taking time off, listeners need a break sometimes. You could spend that time maybe collecting, maybe spend some time thinking of some marketing things you want to do. Some marketing things. Anyway, another tip about and then I want to make sure I have all your questions about that before we move on. But the Pocket Casts is my favorite app. That's how I listen. And actually, I think it's a big, podcast nerds love it for some reason. If you go to podcast events, everyone's listening on podcast. And they have a newsletter. So it's pretty big for like heavy podcast newsletter or listeners. And they have a newsletter. If you sign up for their newsletter, they only send it like once a month and it's looking for opportunities to feature shows. I don't think many people know about this. So they'll say, do you have a science show? Send it to us. So I read it every single week and I think about all my clients. I would subscribe to it and every single week see if there's something you could pitch. And also sometimes they have deals on ads and stuff like that. But like, I just don't think enough people subscribe to that. And it's a real person on the other end of the thing, taking your suggestions. Okay, so do you have any more questions about pitching to apps? Because then I can talk about a few more PR things.
Nope.
Okay. Because I do want to spend some time talking about marketing. And I do want to spend some time, maybe if we have some extra time, we can see if anybody in the audience has questions. But so obviously, this would be really fun. Pitching you to be on other podcasts. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been on?
We have.
Okay. How did that happen?
I think it was all somewhat organic. My wife was virtually attending a kind of a podcasters group, and we have stories that occupy so many things. But one podcast we were on was a career development one, and this was a very long time ago. And another one was actually a wedding story type podcast, because we have some interesting stories from our wedding. So it was all somewhat organic, but very much in line with, where that podcast, we were meeting that podcast where it was.
I actually wanted a little more details about the brawl at your wedding, but maybe you talk about it on another episode. But I heard like not enough information. I was like, what? Anyway, I'll listen more later. But yeah, your wedding sounded amazing.
Because of the brawl?
No, because of everything. But I really I want to know details about that. But anyway, bonus content, perhaps. Anyway, so that's awesome. I think that's a great thing to do, and I think I would make actually this is maybe take a month off and maybe spend some time, do like 3 weeks planning this out. This is what I would do if I were you. So we're going to talk about podcast friends. I'm going to bring it up a lot though, but like, you make a list of your podcast friends, basically. I would do, I think a lot of people think genre matches, right? If you have a food podcast, you're going to look at other food podcasts. If you have a friendship podcast, you're going to look at other friendship podcasts. But honestly, I would say a vibe match is even more important. Because think about it. If you are a politics podcast and you go to other politics, what if the vibes are not right? That's a disaster. We contain multitudes. Right. I listen to friendship podcasts and food podcasts. Maybe the food podcast is right for you because the vibe is the same. So when you're making your podcast friends, I would make a list and find shows that you just think, oh man, this is like, I like this. People that like my show are going to like this. So, and I would also do a mix of like really big shows and the shows that are the same size as you and the shows that are even smaller than yours. So that's how you get your list. And I'm going to give more details about that later. But if they have interviews, I would pitch you and Fern together to be, okay, if you don't have podcast friends, I will teach you how to get them.
Okay.
By and large, podcasters are pretty gosh darn friendly.
That is why
I like talking.
Yep. We kind of geek out on similar things.
That is why I love my job. I'm so glad you asked. That's one of my favorite questions to answer. We're going to get to it. But I would, you and Fern together is what I would say for this. So I would go out to them. And the thing is, even if a show didn't have interviews, I'm sure that Matt, I bet you get bad pitches, right? People that want to be on your show. And you're like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
That's the most insulting thing ever. So I would never email a show that didn't have guests and be like, hey, can Fern and I be on your show? Because that's like, yikes. But like if you became podcast friends first and you were talking a lot, you actually knew each other, then maybe something organic would happen. What if they didn't have interviews, but you decided, you know what, these two, like it was a what if it was a food podcast that didn't have interviews and you wanted to have an episode about like going out to like how to bond your friends over food or meals or something like that. That would maybe be a bonus episode that went on both feeds or something like that. So it just takes a little bit more of your producer mind. You're thinking, how can I get in front of this audience? That's what you really are doing with podcasts.
Right. Because it honestly feels like for our podcast, Fawn and I very much we're selling our personalities more so than anything else, and the interplay between us.
Right. So you two could talk about food. You could talk about anything. So
right. Yeah. And we would talk about being vegan on the food, and we would, because we're out there, we're not. We are edited, but we aren't edited all at once. So it's a very, very honest show.
I love that. So I'm going to tell you a story that maybe you can pull from for tips. So I had a journalist who had a show called All the Wiser, and she interviewed fascinating people on her show, and she wanted me to pitch her to other podcasts. It's kind of like, how do you pitch someone that's just interviewing people all the time? You know what I mean? She's not like, she's not a
Right.
whatever. So I pitched reverse interviews. So I pitched people and said, hey, I said to Danny Shapiro, Family Secrets, you're used to people pitching you to be on your show and get interviewed. My client wants to come on your show. She's a journalist to interview you on your show.
Right.
So that's offering something. First of all, it stood out. It's a pitch that they're not used to getting. And second of all, it's offering like a service. So I feel like if I were you and Fern, I would think about how you could pitch yourself as kind of like, what if, listen, you might not like this idea, but maybe it'll help you think of something better. What if you made like a friendship, like not quiz, but like some sort of test or something to bond with the friends that you have, or something like that, where you could walk a host through it. You could come to the show and say, Fern and I want to, help you, you know what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
So think of something like that, where they're not just getting a pitch where it's like, yo, will you please interview me and Fern? It's like, I have my producer hat on. I like your show. I know the kind of stuff you have. Here's an idea for an episode. It's a little crazy. We'll come on your show and we'll give you an audit of your friendship. I don't know, whatever. It's just the more creative, the better. So that's one way that you can pitch yourself to be a guest. But if they have, regular interview shows, maybe I would also go after shows that have friends on them, even if they're not talking about friendship. Just two friends on a chat show and say, hey, we literally are a friendship. Can we please talk about your friendship? We want, because I bet if there's other show, there's tons of shows with two friends as hosts. It's such a big thing.
Right.
A big list of them and say, you guys are usually talking about sports. Have you ever talked about your friendship on the podcast? Because your listeners want to know about that. And we are friendship experts. I would just think of yourself as a friendship expert. You are now a friendship expert. So go into those shows and be like, your audience is not used to hearing you talk about your friendship, but they all know your friends and they love you. That they come in every week. They have a parasocial relationship with you. Here I am. Let me on your show. So that's how I would pitch. And so the more, for everyone listening, the more creative ways you can think to pitch yourself, the better. So I want to talk about one more pitching thing before I get into Podcast Friends, which kind of goes into marketing. But also I would pitch podcast newsletters, not just because I have to, but I think podcast newsletters, social media doesn't really convert, and we don't have enough time to talk about why. It's a lot of people that don't listen to podcasts. Also, if I'm on TikTok, I don't want to leave TikTok. Literally no one can. It's impossible. So people don't generally like to leave a platform to go listen to a podcast. So it's a good reminder. It's good to be on social. It's not bad. It's like, yes, reminder. But just if you're spending too much time on it, I would cut out a little bit of that time and put it towards pitching yourself to newsletters. Because people that read podcast newsletters are so into podcasts. They are actively seeking new things to listen to. Your show should be in there. And I just don't think people are spending enough time pitching them. So I think on, Google best podcast newsletters, because just subscribe to all of them and maybe set up a separate email account so you can subscribe to all of them and understand what they are about before you pitch them. Like, there's a podcast newsletter I love called Pod the North. It is only for Canadian podcasts. I do not pitch my clients to Pod the North unless they're Canadian. So you have to know the vibes of right. James Cridland does this newsletter called Pod News. It's fantastic. I read it every single day. He wants like news and trends. My podcast newsletter, I don't care about news or trends. You're not going to learn anything in my newsletter. It's what it was Lauren Passell like to listen to. So it's like you have to get to know the writer and see if you're a good fit. And one more tip about pitching newsletters. I get a lot of cold pitches that I don't have time to read. But when I send out a newsletter, I'm monitoring every single response I get because I want to make sure I didn't make a mistake or something. I would subscribe to a newsletter, open it up every week for a little bit, read it, get to know it. Send your pitch in a response to the newsletter that they sent out, because they're actually going to read it. And then they'll see, oh my gosh, Matt, he reads my newsletter. He's a member of my community.
I'd love to. There you go. Right. I was going to ask click tracking. So yeah, make sure that you do all the stuff that as a techie, I don't do because I don't like being tracked, but allow yourself to be tracked and
it's a friend
deliberate about the whole thing.
Yeah. So then I'm really glad someone asked about podcast friends. Because that is my favorite part of my job. It is what I spend the most time doing. When I get a client, I start making this humongous list of them. And, you might start with just shows that you like. A lot of times, podcast friends are literally just shows that people like. But there is a lot of research in this. And, there's a lot of different tools you can use. One of the tools I use this is going to sound a little hacky, but I just, I'm going to use American Hysteria as a podcast. I'll use that as an example. I will look up American Hysteria on Apple Podcasts on my app and all the apps. And if you scroll down to the bottom, it'll say listeners also like. This is a great way to start building your list. If your show is smaller, you might not get great matches, but it's a good start. And what you might want to do is put a comp in that's not yours. So maybe put in a show that's similar to yours, but it's a little bigger so you can get better data. I'm sure that you understand this because you're a techie person. But that's going to be a great list to start. And then I would love everyone right now to go to, if you're at your computer and you don't have to, but if you go to raphonic.com/graph, it is one of my favorite websites. I should get it tattooed on my arm because I talk about it so much. They do not pay me to say this. Raphonic is an expensive analytics tool. You don't have to buy it. Raphonic.com/graph is free. And it uses Apple data to show you a visual representation of your podcast galaxy or neighborhood. This is going to show you your podcast friends. First of all, when I show this to my clients, if they don't act really excited, my feelings get hurt. So please, at least everyone in the comments, standing ovation for raphonic.com/graph, because get me on a Friday night with a bottle of wine and I'm on raphonic.com/graph all night looking in rabbit holes, because it shows you, if you go on it, it's like your show will be at the center of this spike and it'll show you all the shows where your podcast friends are. And you can swivel it and zoom in. And if you see a good one, and sometimes you might have to put in a comp, put in a show that's a little bit bigger, yours that's similar. For you, if you're not getting a lot of data, I would put in a show called Just Between Us. And actually, I would look up the show Just Between Us for you as something to kind of like maybe pitch yourself to or something like that. Because that's a podcast. It's about a lot of things, but it's two friends. So that's how I start going down rabbit holes. Because if I see one that I like, I'm like, ooh, Just Between Us. I click on it and then I go and explore that neighborhood. And so now I'm just going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole. There's also a couple websites like Listen Notes is kind of like a Wikipedia for podcast friends. I always look on Listen Notes because if you type in a podcast, it'll say listeners, you also like this. So you're looking for those places that are curating those lists for you, basically. And I just want to keep in mind that you are thinking of genre matches and vibe matches. What else? There's Good Pods. Also, Player FM is an app. It's a podcast app. But they have really good lists. So this is like a hack. This is like weird that I do this. But like if I have a client that's we're going to use you. A friendship podcast. I would go to, this is what I would Google. Best friendship podcasts, Player FM. They're going to have a really big list for you. And I don't know if this example will resonate with you, but it's kind of like shopping at TJ Maxx. There's like a lot, like you have to go through the hangers a little bit. Like there's a ton, they're not all going to be right. But what I like about Player FM is when you click and they're going to give you this huge list of friendship podcasts, it'll say at the very, very top, last published 2 days ago, last published 2 weeks ago.
Which is so important because everybody's done a 3-episode arc on a podcast and then never again.
Exactly. So you don't have to waste time. You can be like, so I really like that about Player FM. It's a little unusual. So that is how I start building my list. Then contacting them is as simple as, sometimes on their social media, you can find their email address or their website. There is a trick. Actually, I think they're going to stop doing this. I think I read they were going to stop doing this. It's kind of like a shady tip. But if you look up an RSS feed, there's an email address in there. And as long, I believe, we really don't want people spamming people with, trying to get, sell something using those email
Right.
addresses. But I believe that if you're emailing a show because you look them up and appreciate them and want to make podcast friends with them, it's okay to look up the RSS feed code and search for the @ symbol and find their email address and email them. I think it is okay. So if someone gets mad, you can blame Lauren. But
Fair enough.
that's one way to find those podcast friends. And I would just, whether you're pitching yourself to be a guest or you're pitching yourself to be in a newsletter, or you're pitching yourself for a couple other things I'm going to talk about. The shorter, the better. You don't need to tell your whole life story in this newsletter. You need to get them to open the door. You need to get them to respond. I would say 1 to 200 words. Sometimes I have a very, very short thing at the very top, and then I'll have artwork. I would put you in front, a photo of you in front, or your cover art or something, so they can see you, and a small description. Really, the shorter, the better. So, and if you're pitching yourself to be on a podcast, I would include bullet points about what you would talk about. When I'm pitching a client to be on a podcast, I'm always thinking, I put my producer hat on and I'm thinking, how can I do the work for them? So they don't have to think about what this episode would sound like. I'm going to do this for them. There's a podcast I love called The Only One in the Room. And it's about people that have ever felt like they were the only ones in the room. When I pitch that show, and every single episode is called like, Lauren Passell is the only one in the room who, set her microwave on fire. That was very specific and true. So that would be my episode title. So when I'm pitching Laura, the subject line is Lauren Passell is the only one in the room who set her microwave on fire.
Right.
Because I'm doing the work of the producer. So that makes it a lot more likely that they'll get it to you.
Gotcha.
So there's other things to do. So we kind of talked about this, pitching yourself to be on these podcasts. We talked about, pitching yourself, pitching newsletters. And I kind of mentioned the feed warmer campaign, but I want to kind of talk about these kind of swaps, because swapping is what works. And that means if you listen, this is a good question. Do you listen to podcasts?
Embarrassingly, no.
Just Fern?
Fawn, yes.
Oh, sorry, Fawn. I'm so sorry. Embarrassing.
All right.
You've been saying Fern the whole time?
For a minute. Stuff happens.
I'm really sorry. I feel bad about that. Okay, just Fawn, listen to podcasts.
Yes.
Okay. Because why did I bring that up? I'm so distracted by the fact that I was not saying her name right.
Foot warmer or
the feed warmer.
podcast friends?
Okay, got it. Fawn will know this. If you listen to podcasts, or anyone listen to podcasts, if you're listening, you're going to hear every once in a while someone say, hey, if you like this show, you'll also like this show. Like it's basically a 30-second ad for another podcast. And sometimes those are paid. Sometimes I'll do paid things. You'll hear an ad for Equifax or something, but sometimes it's for other podcasts. A lot of those are set up manually by the podcasters, and it's really what works. If you can remember one tip, there's a lot of uncertainties about podcast marketing, but one thing I can say with certainty is what works is borrowing audiences. And, so what you could do with you have your list of podcast friends. Here's what I do. I have my list of podcast friends. And then at the top, I say podcast friends, podcast play date. This is so up your alley. So what is the play date I'm going to put my podcast on with these podcast friends? What is the partnership? Are we going to be on each other's podcast as guests? Are we doing a 30-second ad read for each other? That's called a promo swap. Are we going to be swapping these promos with each other? Are we going to do a feed swap, which means I'm going to send them an entire episode of Our Friendly World for them, and they're going to upload that onto their feed, and they're going to send me an episode. I'm going to upload that to the Our Friendly World feed. That's called a feed swap. Maybe you're doing a mixture of the two things. Maybe you're pitching a show so much bigger than yours, and so you're going to say, like, Just Between Us, I think, is bigger than your show. What if you said to them, this is just an example, we're going to put an entire episode of Just Between Us on our feed. We found this episode. Our audience is really going to love it. It's going to drive them to your show. All you have to do is do a 30-second ad read for us in exchange. So you know what I mean? It's really like finding these podcast friends and thinking, what do they have and what do they want? And what do I have and what do I want? And you might have to put your bargaining hat on a little bit and work with them. But there's all sorts of other things. I think of it as like a podcast friendship, because there's no limits to what you can do. Like I was talking to somebody about one of my clients, and I said, yeah, she's going to South by Southwest. And they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to South by Southwest. We have a panel. And I was like, can my client be on your panel? And they were like, sure. So it's like, you never know if you're just making these friends. This is what happens. And this is why I love the audio community, because that's why I love my job, because everyone is also very open to partnering with people and helping each other. I've worked in a lot of kinds of media. I've never been in a kind of media where people were so willing to help each other. And I will say a note, fiction podcasts, I find, are often more willing to work with each other than nonfiction, just a side note. But so that what I mean, why that's important is because it's like, even if a show is bigger than my client's show, sometimes they're really willing to help. So I would say, don't be afraid to pitch these podcast friendship ideas to shows that are a lot bigger than yours.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the pitch is like, this is good content. And that's why it's funny, because the promo swap I was telling you about, where it's like a 30-second ad, most of the time, I will say people want to go number for number a little bit in the general area of number for number, because it's an ad. It sounds like an ad. But these feed swaps where you're swapping an entire episode, that doesn't feel like an ad so much. That feels like great content. So if you're just considering it a value add, if you just get a really good episode, the person might really just want to run your wonderful episode. Also, I kind of forgot to mention this. If you have podcast, and I did listen to episodes where there were people on your podcast, I would try to get people with podcasts on your podcast, because then you could later, if you think the episode went well, if you think that they liked it, you could ask them to put it on their feed. You could say, hey,
of course.
Oh my gosh, have you ever seen, like, at Christmas, it's like rerun, every holiday, rerun. I would say, and once again, I would say, hey, your listeners are used to hearing you interview someone, but on my show, you're being interviewed. Will you put this on your feed?
Right.
So there's a bunch of stuff you can do. Oh, and one more thing about the podcast friends. Actually, if you go to tinkmedia.co, I can't remember if there's that's my website. I can't remember if there's a short URL, but I was asking about your database because I built a swap database. Yeah, if you go to tinkmedia.co/swap-database. I mean, it's also like shopping at TJ Maxx. You have to go around in there a little bit, but I really wanted a place and this is not an advertisement for my database, but like this can't be fancy. I don't know how to make fancy things. This just needs to go up there. So I use an Airtable. All you do is you put your show in, you put a general size and some tags, and you can search other shows that might be your good podcast friends. You can find friends in the podcast. In fact, I think I'm going to rename it the Friendship Database, because I've been at Podcast Movement and people have come up to me and said, I met my co-host in your database. Now we have a podcast together. Or
nice.
Or one time someone was like, yeah, I'm on this panel and I met someone in your podcast database and I invited them to be on my panel. Like, so you never know. This is how you find the podcast. The good thing is too, if you find a podcast on like Listen Notes or something and you email them and say, would you like to do a promo swap with me? They might be like, oh, what? And you're going to have to like teach them about marketing and whatever. If you reach out to the people in the database, they understand why you're emailing them. I found you in the Tink partnership database. Do you want to do something with me?
Nice.
I think, Craig, what do you think about slowing down, seeing if Matt has other questions? Because I've been talking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Matt, or anyone kind of listening, if you want to pop in the chat and ask questions, I have one of my own. If Matt, I don't want to put the pressure on you, but if you have questions, you are our subject. So we'll let you go first if you have something for Lauren.
Well, it is interesting, the whole take a break. The other aspect of our show, and I know I mentioned it right at the start, it's almost like the big hidden secret about our show is that there is a loneliness epidemic, and that is just what it is, and it exists, but we never talk about it because we always want our show to be uplifting and light and fun. Overall, we don't want to say, oh my God, not having friends is as bad as smoking 2 packs of cigarettes every day and all the rest of it, right? We don't want to preach doom and gloom. Is that a mistake? Because we really want to keep it, the thought has been just for years, light and friendly, but...
Well, you know what I would do for you? And actually, this is a good suggestion for you anyway, and anyone who's had a podcast for even 8 months or longer, I would do an audience survey. Have you ever done an audience survey?
No.
I think your listeners would love it because first of all, you would learn so much. And second of all, they would feel like you're including them in the decisions you're making about the show. You are all friends. They have a parasocial friendship with you.
True.
You're asking what they think and honoring their opinion and saying, we are considering, we don't do this and we want to know what you think. And there's other questions I would ask. I would ask, where did you find this podcast? Because for marketing purposes, you get your list of your podcast friends. I would ask, how would you describe this podcast to a friend? Just to hear how people describe your podcast. I would hear, what would you miss about this podcast if it went away? So you can find what people like about it. I would say, is this podcast too long or too short? Don't say, is it too long? Because they'll just be like, no, it's fine. If you say, would you make it longer or shorter? So they have to say if it's too long or too short. So there's some questions. I'm pulling these from Tom Webster, is this great data guy. And he did this, he's written a book and he has this article with Sounds Profitable called What We Talk About When We Talk About Podcasting. And he puts some great interview questions in. And I think survey questions. I think doing a survey, I can't tell you what to do, but I do think experimenting is always good. And asking your listeners is always good too. I would not be afraid to do that. But if you felt better, do the survey.
Yeah, as far as length goes, it's whatever we feel like that week. Some weeks are very, very short. Other weeks, especially if we interview, they tend to go long. Or if we have a very meaty subject to kind of tackle, which we do. But yeah, we kind of run the gamut. Is that an issue? Should we try and keep it to a tight 38 minutes or three-part story arc or whatever it is that you're supposed to have?
I think if you're doing really long episodes, I would split them up. Because I think people do like consistency too. Once again, as long as what if you had your shorter episodes, the first and third weeks of the month or something like that? Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's hard as a listener to be like just pressing play and thinking you're getting something. Oh, I'm settling down, with our friendly world. Ooh, and then it's shorter than I think it's going to be. Or do you know what I mean? I actually think consistency kind of matters.
Interesting. Okay. Ooh. And that's very, very fair. It's just there's an authenticity that also then blends to it. I mean, sometimes my wife literally likes to not tell me what the episode's about until she says it on the show, and I'm like,
this is maybe where
well, okay then.
You could maybe start a Patreon or something, or do you have bonus? It doesn't even have to be on Patreon. You could just do bonus content and say, here's the unedited, the full tape. This is for the super nerds that want to hear everything.
Well, yeah, except for we fight on the show and we'll edit that down somewhat, not entirely, but we will edit that down. And there have been occasions where there was one occasion where I stormed off I was like, no, we're not doing this. And that got edited out, thank goodness. But I don't know if unedited content, I'm not sure people are going to want to peer behind that curtain.
No.
Hey, Lauren, I have a question about the duration. One, I guess two things, just anecdotes from my own show, which is like 370 episodes at this point. One is like the format has changed a lot over the years. And I started getting feedback. I didn't ask, but I always just say like, hey, shoot me a message, whatever. And I started getting a lot of feedback for a specific format of the show, which was different than I had done for a long time. And so like, I think that's just a like eye opener for me and maybe everybody is like, hey, even though you've done it this way for 300 episodes, like I tried this other thing and people were like, whoa, I really like this. Like you should do more of that. And I didn't even ask, but like I should have asked. And that was cool. Mark, the format change was just me talking in shorter episodes. To the second point, which was for 300 episodes, I had a co-host. So the episodes were all like 45 minutes. And then they go to like 7 to 15 minutes of just me talking. Cause like freaking just you talking for 45 minutes is literally impossible. Like maybe 20 minutes I can do. But what I find now is the format is about half and half, just me talking, short. And then when I have an interview, they're always 45 minutes. And so if you look at the feed for my show, it's like 7 minutes, 12 minutes, 45 minutes. And so the format dictates the length to a large extent. And so I'm consistent within the format.
That's great. Mm-hmm. What I would do though is just in the subject or the title of the episode, just make it really clear.
Yeah. Sure.
So people know, oh, this one's going to be 45. This is a longer one. Or like, like just Craig or something. Craig time. I don't know.
Solo with Craig.
Yeah.
Yep.
Whatever you want to indicate. Yeah. But I think that's great.
Cool. So we have time for maybe like one more question for anyone in the audience or Matt, if you have any questions, or if you think Fawn would have any questions that you wanted to ask Lauren.
Why don't we take one from the audience?
Cool. I think we had one before, and it was, if you're appearing live on another podcast, should you be there to represent your specialist topic or just yourself personally, which is better?
Good question. I mean, I think it depends, because I think it's great if you can. It also depends on what your goal is. Everything comes back to what your goal is. I actually sit down with podcasters a lot and say, what is your goal? And they don't have an answer to that question. So I think moving back, definitely think about what your goal is. If you're trying to like become an expert in something, I think that is probably your number one priority. If you're trying to sell something, or do you know what I mean? Like really hone yourself in or identify as this one thing, I would absolutely make that my number one priority because we don't have all day, and that's how you're going to get the best results. However, when I have a client, sometimes I'm like, how much fun are you willing to have here? I'll be like, have you seen a ghost? Because I could get you on a ghost telling podcast and you can talk about that. And then people are going to get to really like you. And so I think it depends on who you are, how playful you're willing to get. And I also think a lot of these questions that it's like, oh no, should I do this or this or this? The questions will answer themselves once you have podcast friends, because it'll become so natural. I talk about podcast marketing a lot. I have a friend that has a ghost telling podcast. It's like a natural thing. She'd be like, do you want to be on my show? Like, sure. You know what I mean? Like, why not? Like, we're friends with each other. We're in the same community. We're going to do it. And then her listeners may like me and my story and be like, what is this girl doing? So I think it might not be the most direct result, but in some ways it might be that we're talking about genre matches and vibe matches, right? Maybe I'm going to get those vibe match people instead of the genre match people. But honestly, I really believe in a vibe match. So I think that they can be really good. Sorry, that was not an answer, but.
No, I think it was a great answer. Yeah, I think it was a great answer. Cool. So we are at the hour. Just to respect everybody's time, we're going to wrap it here. Matt, thank you so much for coming on and being our crash test dummy, our subject. I learned a ton.
Thank you so
I think
much.
everybody else here did too. And I hope that's helpful for you and Fawn. Lauren, thank you so much for sharing everything about podcast production, growing your audience. Folks who want to learn more about Lauren and what she does, tinkmedia.co. We'll be sending out an email to kind of wrap this up with a replay, and we'll include Lauren's information there so you can reach out to her if you want to learn more about working together. I'm Craig Hewitt from Castos. Thank you so much. And we're going to wrap it up here. And Matt and Lauren, we're going to hit the little exit button, and it's just going to kill the whole thing. So it's not like we'll get to chat afterwards. Okay,
that's very
But thank you all so much. And I really appreciate it. I'll catch up with both of you over email in the next day or so. So thank you very much.
And thank you.
Okay.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thanks,
and check out Our Friendly World with Fawn and Matt podcast.com.
Love it. Thanks, Matt.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye.